It began in the spring of 1856, deep in the cotton-thick heart of southern Georgia, when a physician rode out to a house that no one in Willow County spoke of anymore. By the time Dr. Marcus Wendell arrived at Magnolia Ridge, the air itself seemed diseased. The trees leaned too close, as if eavesdropping on a secret they had carried for years. Inside, he found Miss Abigail Thornwood, once one of the wealthiest women in the state, reduced to little more than bone and parchment skin. Her weight had fallen from nearly 300 pounds to barely 90. The smell of laudanum and decay clung to the bedclothes like guilt. She should have been dead already. But she wasn't. She was waiting. In the corner of her room sat a man motionless, silent, eyes hollow, a freed slave named Samuel, the only person left in that house of ghosts. Dr. Wendell would later write that he had expected to find a sick woman and her caretaker. Instead, he found two survivors of the same execution, still breathing long after the sentence had been carried out. For 9 years, Samuel had lived under Abigail's roof. For 6 of those, he had been her servant, her confidant, her obsession, and for all 9, he had been her undoing. Beside her bed were 17 leather-bound journals, written in Abigail's trembling hand, pages filled not with prayers or ledgers, but confessions, words so disturbing that Wendell would seal them in an iron chest and instruct they not be opened for 100 years. Because what those journals revealed was not just madness. It was a love story so poisoned by vengeance that it blurred the line between victim and monster. Abigail Thornwood had fallen in love with a man who had come to destroy her, and Samuel, an enslaved man turned architect of revenge, had spent nearly a decade dismantling her life, piece by piece, until he discovered that the woman he hated was not his enemy at all, but the mirror of his own suffering. When the physician entered that room, he did not find a murderer and her prey. He found 2 ghosts still tethered by guilt, waiting for death to settle the score that love could not. "You must read the journals," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking like dry paper. "Not for me. For him. For anyone who still believes revenge brings peace." Wendell would later write that he saw in her eyes the one truth that centuries of cruelty had tried to erase, that every act of vengeance eventually circles back to the one who begins it. Before she died, Abigail Thornwood said only one more thing, a line that would echo through the journals, through time, through the ruin of her house and the silence of the fields that outlived them both. "We destroy each other, Doctor, but it's the system that builds us to do it." And when Wendell stepped into the room next door, Samuel's room, he understood what she meant. On the desk were letters, dozens of them, letters that told a story so cold, so calculated, it would make even the devil blush. A story that began 9 years earlier, with the purchase of one man. In the late summer of 1847, the Savannah slave market was a theater of cruelty dressed as commerce. The air reeked of salt, sweat, and speculation. Men with ledgers judged bodies as they would livestock, each sale punctuated by the sound of a gavel, the price of a human life made official. Among the faces in that crowd was a man who seemed both part of it and apart from it. Samuel, 25 years old, strong, silent, and unsmiling. The bill of sale described him in the usual legal language: one Negro man, sound in body and limb, no known defects or rebellious tendencies. But the eyes that stared out from beneath his hat told another story entirely. They were calm, intelligent, watching everything. Later witnesses from Magnolia Ridge would say that even then, Samuel had the look of someone who had already decided the outcome of his life, that the market wasn't selling him so much as ushering him toward a plan years in the making. He was purchased for $1.200 by Miss Abigail Thornwood, mistress of one of the last remaining estates in Willow County. The locals whispered that she had bought him not for the fields, but for the house, and perhaps, though she didn't know it yet, for herself. Magnolia Ridge stood isolated on a rise above the swamp, its great white columns stained by humidity and the slow rot of wealth. Abigail, then 28, ruled over 450 acres, 63 enslaved people, and an emptiness that no amount of property could fill. She was not what society wanted from its plantation mistresses. Too large, too plain, too blunt. The women of neighboring estates called her Miss Thorn behind their lace fans. She attended fewer and fewer gatherings, retreating instead to her library, her roses, and her solitude. In private correspondence, other planters wrote of her with the kind of cruelty that passes for wit among the powerful. Poor Miss Thornwood, one letter sneered, rich enough to buy devotion, but too ugly to keep it. When Samuel arrived, he was assigned to the main house to serve, observe, and wait. Abigail first saw him carrying her luggage from the carriage yard. She later recorded in her journal, "He moves differently, not timidly, as most do. He walks as though measuring distance between himself and everyone else." It began there, a curiosity too subtle to name, growing in the silence between orders and obedience. Samuel studied her just as carefully. In the first weeks, he spoke little, answered every command with yes, Miss Thornwood, and listened to everything. He learned the rhythm of her days, the fragile rituals that kept her loneliness from swallowing her whole, the morning tea at 7, the walk through the gardens at 9, the hours she spent reading poetry she pretended not to understand. What she could not know was that every small kindness, every polite smile she offered, was being catalogued in a mind trained for patience and vengeance. "The daughter of my father's murderer lives in a house built from our suffering," he wrote to his contact in South Carolina, a man known only as Marcus. "She does not yet know that the ghost of what her father did stands in her parlor and serves her supper." In September, Abigail assigned him to the rose garden. It was a decision made out of thoughtless generosity. She told herself that a man with hands as steady as his should not waste them on the fields. In truth, it was an excuse to see him more often. She would come down in the afternoons, pretending to inspect the blooms, asking questions about soil, weather, and pruning. He would answer with just enough intelligence to make her curious. "You read, don't you?" she asked one day. "Only what's written on men's faces." "Ma'am," he said. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months. That night she wrote in her diary, "He sees me, truly sees me, not as they do, not as a curiosity or a burden, but as a person." It was the same night Samuel wrote another letter to Marcus. "The trap is open." She walks toward it willingly. By the end of that autumn, the boundaries of propriety had begun to blur. He dined closer to the main table. His clothes were better. He was permitted to speak. Neighbors began to notice. Martha Whitmore, the wife of a nearby planter, would later recall a visit to Magnolia Ridge that left her uneasy. She laughed with him. Doctor laughed as though speaking with an equal. But Abigail was beyond caring. She had lived too long without laughter. Samuel, meanwhile, had begun the slowest, most dangerous seduction imaginable, not of her body, but of her mind. He gave her the one thing her world had never offered recognition. When she spoke of loneliness, he listened. When she doubted herself, he assured. When she imagined a gentler way to run the plantation, he called her a visionary. Each word, each look, each pause perfectly measured to make her believe he was safe. Trust is built not by truth, he wrote in his private notes, but by precision. By winter, Magnolia Ridge had changed in ways too subtle for outsiders to notice but too deep to reverse. The mistress had begun to smile again. The slave had begun to lead. And somewhere between those two illusions, something irreversible took root. When the frost came that December, Abigail stood at her window watching Samuel work among the bare rose bushes. He looked up once, as though sensing her gaze, and for a heartbeat they simply stared at each other, two people divided by law, class, and history, yet bound by something neither would name aloud. It was that moment brief, almost silent, that sealed both of their fates, because what Abigail saw as connection, Samuel saw as opportunity, and what he did not yet know was that every step toward her would lead him closer to his own undoing. The journals would later call it the first thaw, the day the cold began to melt and rot began to bloom. By the spring of 1848, Magnolia Ridge had grown quieter than ever. The fields hummed with cicadas. The house stood immaculate, and the neighbors had stopped visiting altogether. Rumor, like the summer heat, had settled over the estate and refused to leave. Inside, Miss Abigail Thornwood lived in a haze of ritual and anticipation. She woke each morning to the sound of Samuel tending the grounds, his measured footsteps moving past her window like a heartbeat. She told herself it was coincidence that she always lingered there, watching, but she wrote in her journal otherwise. His silence steadies me. When he looks at me, the noise in my mind goes quiet. To the casual observer, nothing seemed improper. Samuel remained deferential, his tone respectful, his eyes downcast when others were present. But alone, the atmosphere between them had changed. He no longer waited for orders. He anticipated them. He no longer asked for permission. He simply acted, and she let him. Every gesture, every pause, every word was part of a strategy that had begun long before he ever set foot on the plantation. The key to power, he once wrote to Marcus, is not to oppose your oppressor, but to make them believe you are their only refuge. And Abigail, wounded by years of ridicule and loneliness, was desperate for refuge. At first, Samuel's plan unfolded with the precision of a man who had studied cruelty until it became second nature. He learned her rhythms, her triggers, her weaknesses. When she grew angry, he was patient. When she doubted herself, he offered reassurance. When she sought forgiveness for her family's sins, which she often did, he offered none. Only understanding. You can't change what was done, he would tell her, but you can live differently. Those words, live differently, became her salvation, and his weapon. By midsummer, Abigail had begun inviting him to read with her in the evenings. She told herself it was education, an act of kindness, but when their hands brushed, turning a page, the air between them seemed to still. In her diary, she described the sensation as a storm behind glass, silent, but ready to break. In Samuel's private notes, the same night bore a different tone. She flinched when our hands touched, fear mixed with longing. It confirms what I suspected. Her loneliness outweighs her guilt. She will cling to the first thing that doesn't hurt her. He was right. As summer deepened, their conversations grew bolder. Abigail spoke of her father, the man she still called the shadow in this house. She told Samuel things she had never spoken aloud to anyone about: the violence, the humiliation, the way she had learned to smile at cruelty until it looked like grace. Samuel listened. He always listened. But inside, something unfamiliar began to stir. The neat lines of his hatred blurred. Her father's brutality had taken his own father's life. He had come here to even that debt. Yet the woman before him, frail, trembling, guilty, looked less like the architect of his suffering than another one of its victims. For the first time, he began to wonder what vengeance meant when the target was already bleeding. In September, Wendell's later reconstruction would note, the shift between them became undeniable. Abigail began referring to him as Mr. Samuel. She allowed him to speak freely, even to contradict her. The other servants noticed, but said nothing. Fear kept them silent. Confusion kept them watching. At dinner one night, she dismissed the overseer mid-meal and asked Samuel to remain. He stood by the window while she spoke, voice trembling, words barely audible over the chirring of crickets outside. "Do you ever hate me?" she asked. He turned, his face unreadable. "Why would I, Mom?" "Because of what I represent." He studied her a moment longer than propriety allowed. "You represent something dying," he said softly, "and most men don't hate what's dying. They just wait for it to finish." She looked away then, but she didn't end the conversation. That night, she wrote, "He told me the truth, and I felt safer than I ever did with a lie." From that evening on, the relationship between mistress and servant became something the world had no language for. Not love, not rebellion, something slower, stranger, an unspoken contract of need. Abigail began to rely on him not just for work, but for existence. When he was gone, the house felt wrong, unfinished. When he entered a room, the air changed. Samuel, meanwhile, continued to report to Marcus, though his letters had grown shorter, less certain, as if he were losing faith in his own mission. I study her sins and find my own reflection. Perhaps that is punishment enough. Still, he continued the performance. Every smile rehearsed, every silence measured. He had promised Marcus revenge, and he meant to deliver it. But beneath the surface, a fracture was forming, not in Abigail, but in him. One evening in late October, a storm broke over the plantation. Abigail found Samuel in the library, closing the shutters against the wind. Lightning flashed, and for an instant their faces were illuminated, hers pale and weary, his calm and unreadable. "Do you believe people can change?" she asked. He hesitated. "I believe people can remember differently." She frowned. "That's not the same. It's the only way we survive," he said. The thunder drowned whatever she might have replied. But in her diary, she wrote that night, "When he speaks, I feel as though he is carving something inside me, not a wound, but a space." And in his own record, the storm lasted an hour. I told myself the unease was weather, but it wasn't. The closer she gets, the more I hear my father's voice whispering, "Don't forgive, don't forget." Yet I find myself wanting to. By winter's first frost, Magnolia Ridge had become a trap of its own design, a place where affection and vengeance slept in the same bed, and where neither could tell which one would wake first. The journals called it the season of silence, the last calm before a decade of ruin, and though no one in Willow County knew it yet, the war that would destroy their world had already begun, not on battlefields, but in a quiet room where a woman and her enemy mistook recognition for redemption. By the spring of 1849, Magnolia Ridge had fallen into a rhythm that looked like peace but felt like waiting. The neighbors whispered that Miss Thornwood had grown strange, that she dined late, dismissed callers, and spent her evenings walking the veranda with her servant as though he were a suitor. But behind the closed shutters, it wasn't scandal that bound them. It was a quiet experiment in power, performed by two souls who no longer remembered who was in control. Abigail wrote, "He does not look at me the way others do. He looks as though I am something to be solved. It should frighten me, yet it steadies me instead." Samuel wrote to Marcus that same week, "The method works. She believes my silences mean understanding. They are only calculation. Each confession she gives becomes a key to her obedience." He had learned her completely, the pace of her breath when she lied, the way her hands trembled when she wanted to be forgiven. He fed her attention in ration doses, withholding warmth the way an overseer withholds food. And she, starved for it, mistook the cruelty for care. Yet even within his precision, something human began to twist. In the diary he kept hidden beneath his cot, one entry stood out among the rest. "She thanked me for kindness I never gave. It unsettles me to be loved for the mask, not the man." That spring, Magnolia Ridge bloomed brighter than ever. The roses grew wild, the crops came early, and for the first time in years, laughter could be heard in the main house. To visitors, the mistress seemed reborn, but the laughter was fragile, like glass beautiful until touched. Abigail's letters to a distant cousin spoke of new management, of a peace I cannot name. She never mentioned Samuel by name, but every sentence circled him like a moth to a flame. "I have found someone who listens as if I am worth hearing." Samuel, meanwhile, began to blur the line between service and mastery. He corrected the overseer in front of the workers. He revised Abigail's ledgers. He decided which debts to pay and which to ignore. The plantation ran better under his quiet rule than it ever had under hers, and she, lonely and grateful, saw this not as usurpation, but as salvation. "He relieves me of decisions," she wrote. Perhaps that is what love is, surrender without fear. In his letters, Samuel began to sound divided, half strategist, half penitent. "Her faith in me grows dangerous. I could take everything now, her wealth, her land, her trust, yet I hesitate. I tell myself it is caution, but I suspect it is pity, and pity is the most corrosive form of mercy. At night, He listened to her breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. Sometimes she cried in her sleep, whispering apologies to no one. The sound hollowed him in ways his revenge had never prepared him for. "How do you punish someone who already punishes themselves?" he wrote. The question would haunt him long after the war ended, long after Magnolia Ridge itself turned to ash. By midsummer, their conversations had turned confessional. They spoke of faith, sin, and the rot at the heart of every kindness. Abigail asked him once if he believed people were born cruel. "No," he said. "Cruelty is taught, same as obedience." She smiled sadly. "Then we are both well educated." That night, she offered him tea on the veranda. The air was heavy with the scent of magnolia, the same sweetness that would one day cling to their graves. The conversation wandered from poetry to pain. Then, after a long silence, she asked the question that would undo them both. "Do you ever forgive?" Samuel looked at her for a long moment before answering. Not until someone asks who should be forgiven first. She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet, but later, she would. The following weeks were a blur of small betrayals disguised as tenderness. He began to step closer when she spoke. She began to let her hand rest near his on the table. When he addressed her as Miss Thornwood, she told him softly, "You may call me Abigail when no one is listening." And so he did. In her journal, she described it as deliverance. "He calls me by name and I feel alive again. It is as though I have waited my whole life to be addressed without ownership." In his, the same moment appeared like anatomy. The first name is a weapon. Once spoken, it binds both ways. One August night, lightning struck a tree near the house. The storm cracked open the sky, and Abigail ran barefoot through the hall. Terrified by the sound, Samuel found her trembling at the base of the stairs, her hair loose, her nightdress clinging to her. He placed his coat around her shoulders. Their eyes met. She whispered, "Stay until it passes." He did. It was that night, she would later write, that she stopped being lonely. And that night, in his diary, Samuel wrote only 5 words. "The plan is in motion." But the next entry, scribbled in the margin, half erased by water stains, revealed something else. Something he would never send to Marcus. "She looked at me with faith, and for the first time, I feared it." That fear was the beginning of his undoing, because when vengeance begins to feel like love, both become indistinguishable, and neither can survive the other. Magnolia Ridge had entered its most dangerous season, not of violence, not yet, but of recognition. And when recognition replaces hate, the next step is always ruin. By the winter of 1850, Magnolia Ridge looked as it always had: white columns, golden fields, a house that whispered old money and older sins. But inside those walls, something had turned. The mistress no longer ruled her estate. The servant did. To the outside world, it seemed like generosity. Abigail Thornwood had softened, they said. She allowed her staff more freedom, trusted her head servant with decisions beyond his station. But to anyone who listened closely, it was not kindness they heard in her voice. It was devotion. And devotion, in Magnolia Ridge, was a kind of possession. Samuel had achieved what no overseer, no suitor, no preacher ever could. He had become the axis of her world. She deferred to him on everything: crop schedules, expenditures, even which callers she should receive. The woman who once commanded dozens now waited for the nod of a man she had bought. But what made it tragic was that she thought it was love. "He knows what I need before I do," she wrote. "For the first time, I am safe in my own house." Samuel, meanwhile, chronicled the transformation with surgical detachment. The exchange is complete. She no longer instructs, she requests. Obedience wears her face now. By day, he ran the plantation. By night, he became her confidant. She began to speak of things no white mistress ever confessed aloud: the nightmares of her father's cruelty, the shame she carried in her own skin, the feeling that she had inherited a curse instead of a fortune. Samuel listened because it fed the plan, but somewhere between pity and purpose, Something dangerous took root, a recognition too human to ignore. He wrote to Marcus that summer, "I was taught that vengeance restores dignity, but there is nothing dignified in pity." And later, a line that Wendell underlined twice when he discovered the letter decades later, "I wanted to break her spirit. Instead, I found the wreckage of one already broken." Abigail's health began to decline that year. Though no illness could be named, she ate little, slept less, and spent hours sitting near the veranda, waiting for Samuel's voice or footsteps, any sound that reminded her she still existed to someone. The cook said she barely spoke to anyone else. The other servants whispered that she had fallen under a spell, but the truth was simpler, and crueler. Abigail had confused care with salvation. One night she told him, "I think you are the only person who ever looked at me without seeing my father." He answered, "That's because I've already met him in every man who ever owned me." She flinched not because the words were cruel, but because they were true. By the spring of 1851, Samuel had become the perfect master, not by law, but by gravity. Everything from the accounts to the household to Abigail herself orbited around him. He did not need to command her. She offered submission as worship. When she spoke his name, it trembled with gratitude. S. says kindness without structure turns to chaos. So I will follow his order. Perhaps order is love. Samuel's response, written that same week, revealed the chilling precision behind her devotion. The closer she clings, the clearer my father's voice becomes. He was beaten for breaking porcelain. I break her soul and call it strategy. And yet beneath that control, something fragile began to unravel. The more she trusted him, the less he trusted himself. The lines between avenger, victim, and accomplice had blurred beyond recognition. He began to dream of his father not as a ghost urging vengeance, but as a witness disappointed by what vengeance had become. In his private notes, Samuel confessed, "I thought I was rewriting the story. I am only repeating it with better manners." One summer night, Abigail joined him in the library after dinner. The air smelled of rain and burnt lamp oil. She stood beside his chair, watching him read one of her father's old ledgers. "Do you hate him still?" she asked quietly. Samuel looked up, surprised. "Who?" "My father." He closed the book slowly. "Every system he built still stands. Hating him would be like hating the air." She nodded, staring at the flame. "Then you hate me too?" He hesitated. "I did." And now, his silence was the first truth he had ever given her. She smiled faintly. Then it settled. She said, "We are both liars." That night, Wendell's records later noted, lightning struck the magnolia tree behind the house. The trunk split clean through, sap steaming in the rain. The servant said it was an omen. Abigail called it renewal. Samuel called it judgment. Neither was wrong. From that night onward, their bond turned physical. Slowly, inevitably, as though it had been scripted since the day she bought him. In her diary, he touched my hand and I stopped, existing as anyone's daughter. I became only the woman who lived to be seen. In his, the act is done. She believes it redemption. I call it completion. But the victory he thought he'd achieved tasted of ash. Each night he left her bed, he felt the weight of something that had no name, guilt, perhaps, or the first shadow of love. He wrote to Marcus one final time, his handwriting unsteady. "The plan is finished, but I no longer know which of us was the target." He never sent the letter. By the end of 1852, Magnolia Ridge stood at its peak. The crops were rich, the books balanced, the mistress docile, and the master invisible. To the world, it was prosperity. To them, it was a quiet apocalypse, a paradise built on the ashes of two ruined souls. And when autumn came, the magnolias bloomed out of season. The servants said it was a miracle. Samuel knew better. He wrote one last line that year before the ink ran out. "Love, when built on revenge, is just another form of bondage. Only this time, the chains are invisible." It was in February of 1854 that the illusion finally cracked. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. The magnolia trees stood bare, their twisted branches clutching at a colorless sky, and the house at Magnolia Ridge had grown oppressively quiet. The servants spoke only in whispers. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly, as though afraid of what they might measure. Abigail Thornwood had been sick for weeks, nothing specific, only a growing weakness that no tonic could cure. She had stopped eating, stopped tending her roses, stopped answering letters, yet her eyes remained bright, feverish, full of that restless curiosity that had always been her salvation and her undoing. And one cold morning, that curiosity led her to Samuel's room. The door stood slightly open, a rare breach of the order he always maintained. Inside, the room was immaculate, the bed made, the wash basin polished. Not a thing out of place except for a small wooden box on the writing desk near the window. It was an unremarkable object, but the air around it felt heavy, electric. She told herself she would only look for a moment, that she had every right to know what he kept locked away. But when her hand touched the lid, she hesitated. Later she would write. Some silences are louder than screams. That box was one of them. The latch gave easily. Inside were bundles of folded letters tied with rough string. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Samuel's precise, deliberate, almost elegant. Her heart hammered as she untied the first bundle and began to read. July 1847. The purchase has been arranged. The Thornwood woman is as described, isolated, sentimental, governed by vanity, disguised as compassion. Entry will be simple. Affection, once earned, will yield obedience. Her hands shook. She turned the page. I will become what she needs, a mirror, a comfort, a salvation. She will not see the trap until it is closed. Each letter unfolded another layer of betrayal plans, observations, reports to someone named Marcus, the tone cold and methodical. There were no declarations of love, no remorse, only the language of manipulation. Her defenses fall quickly when reminded of her father. Guilt makes her malleable. Soon, she will believe my presence divine. She dropped the letter, bile rising in her throat. The room seemed to tilt. All those nights, all those quiet words spoken in the dark, calculated, every act of tenderness choreographed. Then she found the one letter that changed everything. My father was murdered at Magnolia Ridge in 1838 by Nathaniel Thornwood, beaten for breaking a porcelain bowl. His name was Eli. I am his son. I return not as property, but as retribution. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that rose in her throat. He was his father's ghost. She would later write, and I was the daughter of the man who killed him. Beneath the letters lay a small leather-bound journal. She opened it and saw Samuel's handwriting again, but this time, different. The early entries were sharp and deliberate, written by a man certain of his mission. But as the pages turned, the writing softened, sentences breaking apart into fragments. She is not her father. She carries his cruelty in her name, but not in her heart. The plan continues. Yet I falter. I feel pity. Then anger at the pity. Marcus would call it weakness. I call it confusion. She prays when she thinks she's alone. I almost joined her tonight. Almost. Abigail read until her hands went numb from the cold. And then she found the page that struck her silent. I have learned that the man I hate no longer exists. His daughter is his victim, not his heir. I came here for justice and found a reflection instead. How can I destroy what has already been destroyed? For a moment, she felt dizzy with relief, proof that he had changed, that maybe their bond had been real after all. But the next lines shattered that hope. If she is a victim, then making her love me will be the final justice. Let her learn how dependence feels. Let her live my father's life in her own heart. Abigail clutched the pages to her chest. Trembling, my father's life, she whispered, in my heart. And then she began to laugh, a thin, broken sound that echoed down the empty hallways like a haunting. When Samuel returned that afternoon, he found the box open, the letters scattered across the desk, and Abigail sitting motionless beside them. She did not look at him at first. When she did, her eyes were dry. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Tell me every word is true." He froze. The silence stretched until it snapped. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "You came here to destroy me." "Yes." "And you succeeded." He took a step forward. "Abigail." She flinched. "Don't. If you touch me, you'll forget again." Her voice was calm, eerily so. "I know why you did it. I read the letter. My father killed your father. The porcelain bowl. The blood. I see it now." She took a shuddering breath. "But did you also know what my father did to me?" Samuel blinked. "What are you talking about?" She laughed once, bitterly. "No. Of course you didn't. You wanted to punish him through me. But he already did that himself." He tried to speak, but she cut him off. "You wanted me to feel helpless. I lived my entire childhood in that word. You wanted me to hate myself. He taught me that, too." The truth hit him like a physical blow. Every ounce of anger, every careful calculation collapsed under the weight of realization. The person he had come to punish had already been living inside the same cage that had birthed his pain. He whispered, "I didn't know." "No," she said softly. "None of you ever do." The storm outside had begun to rise again, wind lashing against the windows, rain hammering the roof. The sound filled the silence between them like a verdict. Abigail gathered the letters into her lap, fingers tracing the ink that had condemned her. "You called this justice," she said, "but all you've done is make me love the man who hates me." Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't hate you anymore." "Then you've failed twice." She stood, trembling, the papers spilling to the floor. "You think this ends with forgiveness?" she asked. "It doesn't. It ends with understanding, and that is worse." He reached for her. "Despérate, Abigail, please." But she only shook her head. "We were both born of his hand," she said. "Your father's blood, my father's sin. Maybe this is what he wanted all along, to make sure neither of us ever healed." Outside, thunder cracked so violently, the house itself seemed to shudder. Inside, neither spoke again. In her final entry that night, Abigail wrote, "He lied to me, and I believed him, but I lied to myself first. When I thought love could wash away the past, it cannot. It only stains differently." And beneath it, in a line of ink so heavy it cut through the paper, "He came here to avenge his father. I became his proof that vengeance never ends." The storm that night was one of those southern tempests that seemed to tear the world apart, thunder rolling like cannon fire across the horizon, rain falling in sheets thick enough to erase the landscape. Inside Magnolia Ridge, the lamps flickered, their flames bending beneath drafts that found their way through the cracked shutters. Abigail Thornwood sat at Samuel's desk, surrounded by the letters that had destroyed her, while the man who wrote them stood motionless in the doorway, soaked, silent, and no longer sure what he was fighting for. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind did all the talking, rattling the windows and moaning through the chimney like a voice from the past. Then, softly, Abigail said, "You should sit. You look as though the house itself might swallow you whole." He didn't move. "You read it all. Every word." She looked up, eyes hollow. "It's strange, isn't it, to see yourself dissected on paper like a frog in a schoolroom? You watched me breathe, bleed, believe. You made my loneliness a study." Samuel's throat tightened. "I thought I understood pain," he said quietly, "until I saw yours written beside mine." "Don't romanticize it," she snapped. "Pain isn't poetry, Samuel. It's just rot. It ruins everything it touches. Your father, my childhood, this house, even you." He flinched, but she continued, her voice steady now. "You wanted to make me feel what your mother felt, powerless, ashamed, broken. Congratulations. You succeeded, but in the process, you became him. The man who hurt her. The man who hurt me. The monster both of us were born from. Her words hung between them, terrible and true. Samuel stepped forward slowly, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You think I don't know that," he said. "I became the thing I swore I'd destroy. I turned revenge into a kind of inheritance. My father's death made me a mirror of his killer." "Then we're reflections," Abigail whispered. "You, the son of a man beaten to death. Me, the daughter of the man who beat him, both trying to escape a story that already ended before we were born." She picked up one of the letters, her voice trembling as she read. "I will teach her the weight of dependence until she cannot breathe without my mercy." She looked at him. "You wrote that, and I believed you loved me." "I didn't," he said, then corrected himself. "At least, not then." "Then when?" "I don't know." He ran a hand over his face, his composure unraveling. "Somewhere between the lies and the silences, between your kindness and my cruelty, you made me forget which part of me was real." Her laugh was bitter. "That's not love, Samuel. That's infection." Lightning lit the room, throwing their faces into stark relief, hers pale and drawn, his hollow-eyed and shaking, the moment stretched thin as a wire. "Finally," she said, "you want the truth, the one you never thought to ask for." He nodded. She took a deep breath, her voice low, deliberate. "The night your father died, I was there." He froze. "What?" "I was 10 years old, hiding in the pantry. My father had beaten me that morning because I dropped a glass. I thought he was gone, but he came back, dragging your father by the arm. I saw it all. The blows, the blood, and I saw the moment it changed." Samuel's breath caught. "Changed?" She nodded. "Your father didn't die for breaking china, Samuel. He died because he tried to stop mine from hitting me again. He told him, no man should raise his hand to a child. That's when my father snapped. He killed him because he was told what was right by the man he owned." The words hit Samuel harder than any whip ever had. His knees almost gave out. "No." "Yes." Her voice was almost tender now. "Your father died trying to protect me, and you've spent your life punishing the child he tried to save." The silence that followed was suffocating. The storm outside seemed to vanish, replaced by the sound of two people remembering how to breathe. Samuel sank into the chair opposite her, his hands shaking. "All these years," he whispered, "I thought he died for a plate, for pride, for something meaningless." Abigail's eyes softened. "He died for something human, for a moment of decency in a place that had none." He buried his face in his hands. "Then everything I've done." "Yes," she said quietly. "Everything." He looked up, his face wet with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. "I destroyed you to honor a man who would have despised what I became." She nodded. "And I loved you because I wanted to believe one good man could come out of this family's curse." Neither moved. Neither spoke. The only sound was the rain easing into silence. The storm finally spent. In that stillness, Abigail reached across the desk and took his trembling hand. "We were never enemies, Samuel," she said, "just different casualties of the same cruelty." He met her chaza. "Then what are we now?" She smiled faintly. "Proof that trauma doesn't choose sides. They stayed that way until dawn, not lovers, not adversaries, just two ruined people holding on to the last truth they could bear." When the morning light finally broke through the windows, it revealed faces hollowed by revelation and sleeplessness. Magnolia Ridge looked peaceful again. But the peace was an illusion, the calm of an aftermath. Abigail whispered, "Do you feel free now?" Samuel shook his head. "Freedom means nothing when you have no one left to forgive." Her final journal entry from that morning would later be found stained with rainwater and blood. "He came to avenge his father. I waited to be saved from mine. We both found the same grave instead." After that storm, time inside Magnolia Ridge ceased to move in any normal way. Days blended into one another, like ink bleeding across wet paper. The servants said the house had gone quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that feels like holding your breath too long. The mistress rarely left her room. The master, who wasn't a master, drifted through the halls like a ghost that refused to choose a grave. For 2 years, 1854 to 1856, the plantation ran itself on habit alone. Crops were tended, meals were cooked, accounts were balanced. But the heart of Magnolia Ridge, the two souls who had built their entire lives around hate, disguised as love, were slowly disintegrating. Abigail's health began to fail first. The woman who had once filled a doorway with her presence now barely filled the space of her bed. Her body, once solid and strong, wasted to little more than bones under silk sheets. Her appetite vanished. Her laughter vanished. Even her reflection, when caught in the mirror, startled her, a stranger staring back. In her journals, the handwriting deteriorated from perfect script to trembling scrawl. I dreamed of him again. He was young, before the lies, before the ruin. He smiled at me as though forgiveness were still possible. But then I woke and remembered that even God would turn from such fools. The house creaks when he walks past my door. It sounds like remorse. She no longer spoke to Samuel directly. Instead, she wrote to him pages upon pages of letters she never gave. Sometimes she left them in the hallway. Sometimes she burned them before the ink dried. The air smelled perpetually of smoke and lavender. One note survived. Pressed between the pages of her Bible, "You came here to punish me for your father's pain, but I think you only reminded me of mine." Samuel deteriorated differently. He remained outwardly composed, but something inside him had broken clean through. He sat for hours each day in the chair beside her bedroom door, silent, unmoving, like a sentinel guarding a tomb that had not yet been sealed. The servants whispered that he'd gone mad, but madness, if it was that, had method. He kept the ledgers immaculate, the grounds pristine, as if order could hold back damnation. In his private notes, discovered years later in a drawer that smelled faintly of laudanum, he wrote, "She is dying by inches. I am dying by memory. The two are not so different. I thought hatred would feed me. Instead, it has eaten me alive." He still visited her each evening, sitting quietly while she pretended to sleep. Sometimes she would speak, her voice thin as paper. "Did it help? Samuel, does my suffering taste like justice?" He never answered. By early 1855, Magnolia Ridge had become a mausoleum of the living. Letters went unanswered. The crops rotted in parts of the field. No one dared speak too loudly. Even the birds seemed to avoid the house, as if nature itself could sense what had been buried there long before anyone died. In late spring, Samuel freed the remaining enslaved families formally. Legally, he walked to the courthouse in Savannah and signed the manumission documents himself. Using the Thornwood seal Abigail gave him in a gesture that neither of them could quite name. When he returned, she was awake, pale as candle wax. "You set them free," she murmured, "and still you stay." He nodded. "Because you can't free yourself," he said. She smiled faintly. "Nor can you." That night, she tried to eat for the first time in days. She managed 3 spoonfuls of broth before collapsing into tears. In her journal, she wrote, "He sits outside my room as if keeping vigil. Though neither of us believes in resurrection, I asked him why he stays. He said, because forgiveness isn't a place you walk away from. And I want to hate him again. It would make dying easier." The final weeks came in fragments. Abigail's sentences grew shorter, like breath itself had turned against her. "I feel his eyes even when the door is closed. He reads aloud from the Psalms. I wonder which of us he's trying to save. He asked if I believe in redemption. I told him it's a cruel word invented by men who've run out of excuses." Dr. Marcus Wendell was summoned in April 1856, but he came too late. He would later write that what he found at Magnolia Ridge was not illness, but aftermath, a woman devoured by her own history, and a man devoured by hers. When Wendell entered her room, Samuel was sitting exactly as the servants had described, still silent, staring into a distance that no one else could see. The journals lay open on the desk. The air smelled of opium and decay. "Doctor," Abigail whispered, "read the journals. Read them all. Not for me, but for the world that created us." Those were nearly her last words. 3 days later, she was gone. Samuel buried her beneath the magnolia tree that had split in the storm 2 years earlier. He placed no marker, only a single stone. He told Wendell it was so no one would know who to blame. He stayed 1 week after the burial. During that time, he divided the estate, freed every soul still bound to the Thornwood name, and sold the property. Then he vanished. On the desk in Abigail's room, Wendell found a final letter addressed to him. It began with the same careful hand that had once written of vengeance and strategy, but ended in uneven strokes. "Dr. Wendell, by the time you read this, I will be gone. The journals you hold are not confessions, they are contagion. Handle them carefully. The sickness inside them is not of the body, but of the soul. Revenge is a language that cannot tell the truth. It speaks only in echoes, and I have become fluent in nothing else. I set out to destroy a woman who carried my father's murderer's blood. Instead, I destroyed the only person who ever saw me as human. I learned too late that suffering does not cancel suffering. It multiplies it. If anyone reads this in the years to come, tell them this: justice without mercy is just a slower kind of cruelty. Abigail forgave me before she died. I cannot forgive myself. Perhaps that is my punishment. Perhaps it is my redemption." Signed simply Samuel. Dr. Wendell sealed the journals and the letter in a metal chest, locking it away with a note that read, "The world is not yet ready for this truth." It would take nearly 70 years before anyone opened that box again, and when they did, they would not find a story of villains and victims, but a mirror, one that reflected everything the human heart is capable of when pain becomes its only teacher. For 67 years, the chest that held the journals of Abigail Thornwood and the final letter of Samuel lay undisturbed in a lawyer's vault in Savannah, locked, catalogued, and forgotten. The world outside changed beyond recognition. Slavery ended. The plantations rotted. Wars came and went. But the box waited as if time itself refused to move until someone was willing to face what lay inside. It was opened at last in 1923. By a man who had no idea that his own bloodline carried the weight of that history, Professor Jonathan Wendell, great-grandson of the physician who had sealed the evidence, was a historian at the University of Georgia. He specialized in Southern folklore, ghost stories, plantation myths, the haunted echoes of a culture that pretended to forget what it had done. When he discovered the key among his late grandfather's effects, he assumed it would lead to some forgotten family papers. What he found instead was Magnolia Ridge. The smell of the past hit him before the lid was fully lifted: old paper, iron, and the faint sweetness of decay. Inside lay 17 journals bound in cracked brown leather, a stack of folded letters tied with fading twine, and a single sealed envelope addressed in his ancestors' precise handwriting, to be opened only when the world is ready to understand that truth is neither weapon nor shield, only mirror. Jonathan read that line 3 times before breaking the seal. The first journal began with Abigail's elegant script, the early pages filled with mundane details: plantation accounts, weather records, social notes. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting began to shift, losing symmetry, becoming desperate, human. He speaks softly, as though each word might break me. Perhaps it already has. I have begun to think of him not as a servant, but as the mirror of my own cage. By the time Jonathan reached the 6th volume, he was no longer reading as a scholar. He was reading as a man watching 2 people slowly destroy themselves. Samuel's letters followed a meticulous documentation of revenge transformed into ruin. Every smile I give her is a blade I twist in my own flesh. She believes she has found compassion. I have only found exhaustion. Jonathan stopped twice while reading, once to catch his breath, and once because his hands were trembling too violently to hold the paper. He wrote in his research diary, These are not just confessions. They are autopsies of the soul, of a nation, of a sickness that still lives in our blood. For months, he pored over the documents, cross-referencing names, dates, and records. He traced Samuel's sale papers in the Savannah courthouse, located the Thornwood property deeds, and found the medical examiner's sealed report on Nathaniel Thornwood's death. That report changed everything. Nathaniel's riding accident had been no accident. The saddle had been deliberately cut. 3 people were implicated in the act, one of them a woman. The woman's description matched Abigail. The men matched 2 enslaved laborers, one of whom was identified as Elias, Samuel's father's brother. The revenge Samuel had spent his life constructing had already been completed 9 years before he ever set foot on Magnolia Ridge. He had destroyed the only surviving participant who had actually helped kill the man who murdered his father. Jonathan sat for hours after reading that line, staring at the wall. Then he wrote in the margin, "History does not repeat itself. It answers questions we were too blind to ask the first time." He presented his findings at a private academic symposium in 1925. His paper was titled, "The Thornwood Papers, a Psychological Case Study of Mutual Destruction." Only 12 people attended. When he finished reading, no one clapped. One historian muttered, "You've written a tragedy, not a thesis." Jonathan replied, "Perhaps that's what history is, a tragedy we keep pretending was an argument." He never published the full account. The university deemed the material too inflammatory, claiming it would misrepresent the moral character of the antebellum South. So Jonathan did what his great-grandfather had done before him. He sealed it again, this time in the archives of the university library, marked under restricted access. Decades later, long after Jonathan's death, the story resurfaced again, this time through an oral narrative passed down among descendants of the enslaved families who once lived at Magnolia Ridge. An elderly woman named Clara Daniels, great-granddaughter of Aunt Celia, told an interviewer in 1971, "My grandmother used to say, that house was cursed. But the curse wasn't ghosts. It was people who couldn't stop hurting each other, even when they wanted to." She described Samuel not as a villain, but as a man who mistook pain for purpose. And Abigail, she was the proof that a slave owner can be a slave, too, only to her own loneliness. Her story matched the journal's word for word. The memory of Magnolia Ridge had survived not in books, but in the hearts of those who had been forced to watch it all unfold. When the archives were finally declassified in 1987, Dr. Helena Morrison, a historian of trauma and post-slavery psychology, published The Magnolia Papers, The Anatomy of Vengeance. Her conclusion echoed through generations. Slavery did not end when the chains were broken. It continued inside the minds of the living, where love and hate became indistinguishable, and every attempt at justice risked repeating the original sin. Her work reframed the story from scandal to warning. Magnolia Ridge became not a ghost story, but a diagnosis of what happens when cruelty becomes inheritance and forgiveness becomes impossible. By the time the 21st century arrived, the plantation itself was gone. The house had burned decades earlier. The fields were overgrown with pine. Only a single magnolia tree remained, its roots entwined around the small, unmarked stone that Samuel had placed above Abigail's grave. Local children called it the tree that breathes. They said if you stood beneath it at midnight, you could hear 2 voices whispering, one male, one female, neither begging, neither accusing, only speaking, as if still trying to understand what went wrong. The final note in the Wendell family archive, written by Jonathan's daughter in 1963, reads, "I have seen the journals. I have read their sorrow. Magnolia Ridge is not a place. It is what happens when pain outlives the people who caused it." And below that, scrawled in faded ink, "May their ghosts rest, not in peace, but in understanding." Magnolia Ridge no longer exists on any modern map. The land where it once stood is a tangle of trees and silence, no markers, no ruins, just wind moving through pine and the faint scent of magnolia blossoms that bloom where no garden should still remember how. But the story never vanished. It lingers not in monuments or textbooks, but in the quiet recognition that every act of cruelty leaves descendants, and every act of vengeance leaves ghosts. A century and a half after Abigail, Thornwood, and Samuel vanished from history, their story continues to echo, not because it is unique, but because it isn't. Every nation built on domination inherits a version of Magnolia Ridge. Every generation faces the same question that neither Abigail nor Samuel could answer. How do you break a cycle when the pain feels like identity itself? Modern historians who revisit the case speak less about guilt and more about inheritance, not the kind written in wills, but the kind carved into memory. Dr. Helena Morrison summarized it best in her 1987 lecture at Columbia. Magnolia Ridge is not a plantation. It is a metaphor for generational trauma. Abigail carried her father's violence in her bones. Samuel carried his father's death in his blood. Both believed that suffering could be purified through pain, that healing required someone else's destruction. And that is the oldest lie history ever told. In classrooms and documentaries, students are asked to decide whether Samuel's revenge was justified. Most begin by saying yes, that he had every right to destroy the daughter of his father's killer. By the end, almost all of them hesitate. They see that the very moment he recognized Abigail's pain, his revenge ceased to have meaning. Because revenge and justice are not the same. Revenge ends a life. Justice ends a pattern. Samuel never reached the latter, and neither, perhaps, have we. Today, the site of Magnolia Ridge is part of a wildlife preserve. Visitors who wander there often report an uncanny quiet, as if the land itself remembers what words can't. At the edge of a clearing stands that single surviving magnolia tree, its roots split around a smooth, parley stone. There is no inscription, only the faint outline of time wearing against stone. Sometimes, on warm nights, petals fall before they've fully opened, scattering like letters never sent. Locals say, if you whisper a secret beneath its branches, the wind carries it back as a question, one that sounds eerily like, whose pain are you still carrying? In the Wendell family archive, the last recorded note attached to the Magnolia Papers was written by Jonathan Wendell's granddaughter in 1994, a century and a half after the tragedy ended. Reading their story made me realize that history does not end. It waits. It waits for someone brave enough to feel it instead of explain it. We inherit their wounds every time we mistake silence for peace. She donated the collection to a museum in Atlanta under one condition, that the journals be displayed side by side, not labeled as master and slave, but as two people broken by the same world. Visitors still pause longest before one particular passage, the final words written in Samuel's hand before he disappeared. My father died trying to stop a man from hurting a child. I spent 9 years hurting that child to avenge him. If there is a hell, it is made of echoes, and I can already hear mine. Isis. The tragedy of Magnolia Ridge endures because it refuses to offer comfort. It is not a tale of redemption, nor a parable of forgiveness neatly achieved. It is a mirror one that shows how systems built on domination deform both the oppressor and the oppressed until their humanity becomes a battlefield. Abigail's journals end with the line, "We destroy what resembles us, not what opposes us." And perhaps that is the truest horror of all. Standing beneath that magnolia tree today, the air heavy with sweetness and rot, one might imagine two voices carried on the wind, one deep, one trembling, still searching for the answer neither could find in life. Not who was right, but what does forgiveness mean when there is no one left to forgive? And so, the story of Magnolia Ridge closes where it began, with a woman and a man, both ruined by a world that taught them pain was the only language love could speak. If this story moved you, let it not be for its tragedy, but for its warning. History will always repeat itself when vengeance is mistaken for justice, and silence is mistaken for peace.